This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh with Amy Goodman. We turn now to Senegal, which is in the midst of its worst political upheaval in decades after President Macky Sall postponed this month's election. More than 200 opposition politicians and protesters have been arrested in recent days, and the government has cut off some internet access. Meanwhile, civil society and opposition groups are calling for a mass mobilization against the delay to the presidential poll. President Sall, whose second term was due to expire in early April, postponed the February 25th vote, citing an electoral dispute between the parliament and the judiciary regarding some of the candidates. Earlier this week, lawmakers voted to postpone the elections until December. The decision paves the way for Sall to remain in office until at least the end of the year. Opposition leaders and candidates rejected the decision, calling it a coup. Senegal has never experienced a coup since gaining independence from France in 1960. Foreign ministers from the West Africa bloc, known as ECOWAS, are due to meet for emergency talks today about the crisis. For more, we're joined by two guests. Mamadou Diouf is a professor of African Studies and the director of the Institute for African Studies at Columbia University, where he joins us from. And joining us from Abidjan in the Ivory Coast is Ousmane Diallo, senior researcher for Senegal and the Sahel at the Amnesty International Office for West and Central Africa. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! I'd like to begin with you, Ousmane Diallo. If you could respond to this latest news and your assessment of why it is that President Sall has postponed the elections.
I think President Sall has postponed the elections for very personal reasons that are mainly linked to probably dealings within his political party. And what has shocked many Senegalese citizens, whether they are politicians or simple citizens going about their daily activities, is the unilateral way in which elections that were due 3 weeks from now were delayed to December by using force, such as pushing out opposition MPs from the National Assembly chamber on Monday in order to vote for the election, for the delay of the elections. Furthermore, this is just the latest episode in a string of human rights abuses and violations in Senegal. We have seen that the internet access via mobile data was cut off between Sunday and Wednesday morning, and that many protesters were arrested. But since March 2021, at least 56 people were killed while participating in protests in Senegal, and we have around 1,000 people detained in various prisons of the country for participating in elections or calling to protest. So this is a really downslide in Senegal, democratic and human rights backsliding. And I think what has irked many citizens about the decision that was announced on Saturday is that this is the latest red line in which the Republican and democratic standings of the country is being compromised by none other than the President of the Republic.
I wanted to go to the former Senegalese Prime Minister, Aminata Touré. Democracy Now! Reached her last night. On Sunday, she was detained for 6 hours before being released. This is what she had to say.
I was a candidate myself, and according to the law, there is 3 ways of collecting sponsorship. You can collect a certain number of parliamentarian or mayor, or you go to what is called the citizen sponsorship, which means you have to collect between 44,000 and 58,000 signatures from voters, which I have done because I led Macky Sall's legislative election list 2 years ago. So I know how to collect this sponsorship, which I have done. And when we came for the control, I mean, it was a foul play. They couldn't find, they said, 13,000 of my sponsors in the file. I came with the evidence and tell them here they are in the 2022 file, but they didn't want to hear anything. So Macky Sall decided that I would not be a candidate. But before that, last year, he removed me forcibly from the parliament, which is never you know, and heard on Sunday. I went to the rally, and the minute I stepped out of my car, I was picked up by the police. I spent, hours being arrested, and they released me without telling me what was wrong, what are the charges, because there were none. And that's the case for thousands of young kids who were protesting in the past months. They are in jail. They're not, they don't have a court day, and this is a mess because we are not used to this. I mean, Senegal is known as the most stable democracy in West Africa, and here is President Macky Sall who's spoiling it. And then we would not let him go. We would not just sit and watch. We will take the street. We will do whatever we need to do to keep the foundation of our democracy solid.
Again, that's the former Senegalese prime minister who was arrested on Sunday for 6 hours, spoke to Democracy Now! Yesterday, Aminata Touré, in Dakar, Senegal. We want to bring Professor Mamadou Diouf into this conversation, speaking to us from Columbia University. Hundreds of people have been arrested in the last days, but this isn't the beginning of the unrest on the ground. Can you respond to what Prime Minister Sall has done and take us back in time, put this in a context back to 1960 when Senegal became an independent nation headed by Léopold Senghor?
Thank you for having me. And it's true that if you want to understand what is happening right now, we have to put it in perspective and have a kind of longue durée approach. Since independence, what has happened in Senegal is basically the fact that a political system was created using the resources of the colonial and actually the resources also of Islam, the kind of pre-colonial culture which allow the Senegalese political class to build on the colonial foundation of a state I called an Islamo-Wolof state, a state in which you have segment of the population who had been able to build a power base and keep negotiating one with the other. And it's what the British political scientist Donald Cruz O'Brien called the Senegalese success story based on a kind of social contract. It did not mean that the country was fully democratic, but it was a country in which you had a kind of open society, engagement between different groups, and possibility always to find a solution to the biggest crises. And I think is what made Senegal a kind of exception. But what we have experiencing since the President Macky Sall was elected is the unraveling of the system. The fact that he has been attacking what has been the basis of the stability of the country. And the turning point basically is when he was re-elected in 2019, he just began planning a possible third term. And that planning is absolutely evident if you look at all his action from 2019. Unfortunately for him, the Senegalese society, this very resourceful society, has been able to resist a third term. And he was soundly defeated by the mobilization of the youth who had been able to say, we want this regime to respect the Constitution. And the fight for the Constitution forced Macky Sall and his group to finally give up the idea of a third term. But he has been keeping, if you want, an approach which is very repressive, which is unknown in Senegal, an approach of centralization, an approach of actually jailing people, in particular his main opponent. And this is the term of a process, which is the process of systematic destruction of the foundation of one of the few democratic systems in Africa.
Diouf, I'd like you to, elaborate on why that's the case. I mean, in this moment, there are people who are speculating that there may actually be some kind of military coup in Senegal. Senegal is, of course, as you said, an exception, considered an exception, the only country in West Africa that has not experienced a military coup. So first of all, do you think that there is a risk that that might happen? And also, what differentiates Senegal in this sense, the relationship of the military to the government compared to its neighbors?
Yeah, according actually to many scholars who have been paying attention, in particular to the military group in West Africa, what they have shown is that the Senegalese military is a very professionalized group, and it's a well-educated group who had been really favored by all the regime since Senghor. And in many cases, times of crises, we know the military did intervene in the process of, in the dialogue process, in the search of a kind of compromise, but without always avoiding taking power. And I think that they are still in the same disposition. In 1962, for example, when Senghor was in conflict with the Prime Minister Mamadou Diouf, though the army actually supported Senghor, they did say that politicians should solve the issue, that the army was not going to intervene. And I think that is what is going to happen if the crisis deepens. They will probably say, okay, this is a situation in which the question is not the army taking over, but the army will make sure that the right solution is found. What has changed, again with President Macky Sall, is today what is called the military police, the gendarmerie in French, is much better equipped probably than the army. And it's a gendarmerie equipped for repression. And, you know, these last 12 years, Macky Sall has invested more in repressive equipment than in education and health.
Ousmane Diallo, we just have a minute. I want to go back to you in the Ivory Coast. You're with Amnesty International, particularly focusing on human rights. I want to ask you about the targeting of journalists and media under Sall, and particularly one private TV station losing its license after showing protests on the ground, internet being cut off, difficult to reach people on the ground, the significance of all of this and where you see the next election happening.
I think those attacks against the press that have occurred over the last 3 years are very symbolic of the repression against independent voices in Senegal. So just on this Tuesday, the broadcasting license of the TV station Walfadjri was withdrawn by the Minister of Telecommunications, who criticized them for covering the protest on Sunday. And this is a very symbolic attack because Walf TV is one of the first private media houses in Senegal. And we know that private media houses such as Walfadjri and Sud FM have been key in opening up the democratic voices and paving the way to political change in 2000 and 2012. And beyond that, I think what has been very hurtful towards Senegalese peoples and their rights have been the recurrent suspension of internet access via mobile data. So this has happened in between Sunday and Wednesday. It had happened in June 2023. It had happened in March 2021. And every time that there are protests in Senegal, this has become a regular feature of the repression of the regime. And if you look at international texts and rulings by the ECOWAS Court of Justice regarding the case of Togo, they have been very clear that this suspension of access to internet are attacks against right to information and press freedom. And I think in a general way, the press has been attacked and have been the victim of repression by the current regime, and as well has been all of the institutions. Professor Diouf has talked about the army, which has been under stress, but also the Constitutional Court, whose rulings are final according to the Senegalese constitutions, but whose legitimacy has been has been criticized and undermined by the actions of the president. And I think all of those contribute to the current stress, the anger, and the mobilization that we are seeing among the Senegalese citizenry.
Thank you so much, Ousmane Diallo. We will continue to follow the story. Amnesty International senior researcher for Senegal and the Sahel, and Professor Mamadou Diouf, a professor of African Studies and director of the Institute for African Studies at Columbia University.